Minchas Osher for Parshas VaYigash, Be'inyan Kvod Aviv Ukvod Zekeno. I found this a very fascinating topic in terms of the relationship to a grandparent, between a grandson and a grandparent. Rav Soloveitchik used to always say that the first grandfather in Jewish history was Yaakov Avinu. What did he mean by that? I mean, after all, Avram was a grandfather to Yaakov, but he meant that the responsibility of a grandfather to a grandson is to teach him Torah. And we don't find that Yaakov received Torah from Avram. We know he received Torah from his father Yitzchak, but we never find a direct link between Avram and Yaakov. But Yaakov taught Torah, according to Chazal, to Ephraim and Menashe, to his grandsons, the sons of Yosef. So in that sense, he was the first grandfather in Jewish history. And on an emotional level, we know that grandchildren are very attached to their grandparents, and those who are born with grandparents are very lucky. Personally, I was only born with one grandparent out of four, and she died when I was 11. There are even grandchildren that will say Kaddish for a grandparent after the grandparent passes away. And those who don't say Kaddish might light a yahrzeit candle. Now, I'm not saying that everyone knows exactly the yahrzeit of their grandparents, and they have it in a book, written, but many people do. And I think there's no doubt that a grandparent could have a great impact on a grandchild. But believe it or not, we're going to see here in Rashi, based on a medrash, in his commentary in our parsha, in Parshas VaYigash, that there is a relationship of kavod, an obligation of kavod between a grandchild and a grandfather. The Torah says, Kabed es avicha v'esimecha. The Torah doesn't say, Kabed es avi avicha, or Kabed es avi imecha. Nowhere do we find explicitly, if we're looking and searching left, right, and center in Tanakh, that the Torah obligates a grandchild in the kavod of his grandparents. Yet, if we were to assume that somewhere between the lines we can come up with a source, or perhaps a svara, if not a source in the Torah itself, for an obligation of a grandchild vis-a-vis his grandparent, assuming that we could do such a thing, then in a case of a collision between the kavod of a parent and the kavod of a grandparent, assuming there is a chiyuv according to halacha to be machabed a grandparent, in a case where, let's say, my father asks me for a cup of tea and my grandfather asks me for a cup of tea, who gets precedence? Meaning, we get into the laws of kedima. But let's keep in mind that the issue of kedima presumes a premise, namely that there is a mitzvah of kibud vis-a-vis a grandparent. In other words, I would never ask you the question, what comes first, a cup of tea for your father or a cup of tea for your grandfather, unless you allow for the premise that there is kavod to a grandparent. If there's a kavod to a grandparent, you might say, well, you know what, maybe the grandparent is an older generation, I have to give them kavod first. Maybe a grandparent is the father of my father, so that therefore I should give cover to a grandfather. Whatever svaras I come up with, I can begin to imagine that there might even be kedima of a grandparent over a parent, possibly. But only if I allow for the premise that there is a chiv kivud to a grandparent. Now, what we're going to see is that when the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah codify the halachos of kibud av ha'em, which of all places is going to be in Yeridea, probably because it doesn't fit into any of the other three halakim of Shulchan Aruch, so it gets shtupped into Yeridea, so that in Simon Reish Mem in Yeridea, which is the Simon dedicated to kibud av ha'em, the Ramah quotes an earlier tshuva of the Marik. Now, keep in mind, the Ramah lived 5+ centuries ago. The Marik was probably a century before the Ramah. And the Marik is quite famous in the annals of halacha for Ashkenazic Jews. Very choshev, one of the pillars of Psak halacha for Ashkenaz. And it's not a matter of milsa zutrasa, of insignificance, that the Ramah would quote the Marik on this very issue. And the Ramah quotes the Marik as paskening that there is no mitzvah, no source, no basis for a mitzvah of kavod vis-a-vis a grandfather. And we're going to see that the Marik seems to have overlooked, in inverted commas, overlooked a Rashi in this week's parsha. Because Rashi is going to project a thesis that Yaakov Avinu actually, in this week's parsha, faced a collision, a tug of war, between the kavod that he had to give to his father Yitzchak and the kavod that he had to give to his grandfather Avram. And Rashi's comment is on a pasuk that says, "Vayisi Yisrael chol shalo vayavo be'eres shava vayizbach zvachim," and the Torah is going to teach us that the zevach that Yaakov brought was for the God of. What I mean, the God of, we have a concept called Elokei Avram, Elokei Yitzchak, Elokei Yaakov. When Yaakov would bring this korban, would it be for the sake of Elokei Yitzchak or for the sake of Elokei Avram? And Rashi, quoting a Medrash, says that Yaakov was sort of in a bind because on the one hand, Kibud Av would require that he say Elokei Yitzchak. On the other hand, Kvod Zekeno, which is Avi Aviv, his grandfather, would require that he would say Elokei Avram. And Rashi points out that the pasuk says Vayizbach Zvachim Elokei Aviv Yitzchak. No mention of Avram. It means, says Rashi, that Chayev Adam B'Chvod Aviv Yoser Mikvod Zekeno. That in a, as we called it, a challenge and a tug of war between the kavod of Aviv and the kavod Zekeno, then kavod Aviv, which is written in the Torah explicitly, Kabed es Avicha, in the Decalogue, takes precedence over kvod Zekeno. And therefore, Leficha, says Rashi, Tola beYitzchak v'lo b'Avram. Yaakov Avinu omits mention of Avram. So there's no Elokei Avram here in the Zevach. It's purely Elokei Yitzchak, his father. But quite obviously, and you don't have to be, a great daikon to see clearly in Rashi that Rashi holds that there is an obligation of kvod Zekeno, and a person does have to give respect to his grandfather, and that Yaakov was in a bind because it was an either-or situation. Either he gives kavod to his father Yitzchak or to his grandfather Avram, and the Torah immortalizes for all eternity the decision that Yaakov gave kavod to his father Yitzchak, completely omitting his grandfather Yaakov, and that's because Gadol Kvod Aviv Yosem Mikvod Zekeno. but obviously we are laying down a premise here in Rashi that there is kvod zakeno. If there was no kvod zakeno, then we wouldn't have to establish a principle based on Yaakov Avinu that the kibbud av takes precedence over kvod zakeno over his grandfather when there is no kvod zakeno. And this is going to be the problem, the kasha that all the Mefarshim are going to raise against the Marik, because as we said before, there are more quotes the Marik in Shulchan Aruch Yordei Reish Mem as saying that there is no mitzvah to be mechabed your grandfather. So then why does Rashi say that the mitzvah of Kvod Aviv takes precedence over the mitzvah of Kvod Zakeno, his grandfather? Obviously then there is a mitzvah of Kvod Zakeno. There is a mitzvah to give kavod to one's grandfather. Otherwise, Rashi doesn't get off the ground. So that now we have a problem in justifying the Marik. In fact, one of the Mefarshim said, could it be the Marik he'elim ayin mirashi ala Torah? Could it be possible that the Marik was unaware of Rashi ala Torah? How could the Marik possibly say that there's no chiyuv of kvod zakeno? And the Ramah, in fact, after quoting the Marik, disagrees with the Marik and postulates and rules that there is an obligation of kvod zakeno, and that the Marik overlooked Rashi ala Torah, which is a pella in and of itself. So the Taz says there in Reish Mem, Tema, I don't understand. Al das hamarik, denela mimenu pirish Rashi b'chumash? How could it be? By the way, on the side, when my wife, my Rebbe, went to seminary, they tested her on Rashi ala Torah. You know, it was assumed that every girl in a Beis Yaakov school certainly knew Rashi ala Chumash. I mean, from a young age, they teach Rashi ala Torah. And for the men folk, you know, if you're a Lubavitcher Chassid, you know that the Rebbe spent endless amount of time and effort and energy on explaining in great depth Rashi ala Torah. So for the Marik, who was one of the pillars of Ashkenazic Psak some 6+ centuries ago, to have overlooked a Rashi ala Torah and came to the mistaken conclusion that there's no chiyuv of kvod zakeno, that is a pella. And the Taz says that the Marsha tried to make an attempt at justifying the Marik's conclusion and somehow reconciling that with Rashi. Now, I don't have in front of me the Marsha, but we do have the Vilna Gaon quoted here on the bottom paragraph on your first page. And the Gaon says that I have two sugyas in Shas that seem to assume, like the Marik, that there's no mitzvah of kvod zakeno. One sugya is in Masechtas Sota on Daf Mem Tes. The Gemara tells us that Rav Acha Bar Yaakov asked his grandson, whose name was Yaakov. That doesn't surprise us if Rav Acha was the son of Yaakov, so it makes sense that his grandson's name was Yaakov. And he asked him for a cup of water. And his grandson, to the surprise of all of us, Rav Yaakov, said to his grandfather, Rav Acha, guess what? Lav brechana. I'm not your son. You want to ask, your son for a cup of water, and he's chayav, he didn't keep it out, go ahead and do so. But you're asking me for a cup of water? Am I your son? And Rashi says, Eina olai lechabdecha. I don't have a chiyuv to be mechabed you. And that's the end of the sugya. So the Gaon proves from this sugya that the Marik is correct. There's no chiyuv to be mechabed your grandson. The Gaon goes on and quotes a second sugya in the Gemara Makos. There the Gemara is talking about a case of Goel Hadam. We know that if, let's say, Ruvain kills Binyamin B'Shogeg, then Binyamin's, let's say, closer kin, let's say he has a brother named, we'll call him Osher, and Osher is chayav to kill Ruvain the Rotzeach, meaning he has a mitzvah according to the Tana that we paskin like, of being a Gol Adam. But the Gemara says that if Reuven is also the father of Asher, meaning that Asher wants to become a Gol Adam to avenge his brother Binyamin's death, is a son to the Rotzeach, then Ein Ben Nasa Gol Adam Liaviv. A son will not kill his father as a Gol Adam. But yet the Gemara assumes that if he's a grandson, then although Ein Ben Nasa Gol Adam Liaviv, Ben Bino Nasa Gol Adam, a grandson will become a Gol Adam to knock off his grandfather, who is the Rotzeach. And on the side, by the way, we talk about a Rotzeach Peshogeg, and one might wonder, why does the Gol Adam have to kill the Rotzeach Peshogeg if he catches him outside the Yer Miklat? So I'm not sure if what I'm going to say now is correct, because I'm not a bucky in criminal law, but I think in most Western societies, there's something called manslaughter. For example, if let's say you jump a red light and you kill someone, you could be locked up in jail for a good couple of decades. So that a shogeg is not an onus. It's not like somebody pushed him off a ledge, but rather he could have been more careful. He should have checked out the situation, and he jumped a light, so to speak, and therefore he's chayev. In a certain sense, he's chayev misa. The Torah gave him out of compassion an ir miklat, but the Gol Adam doesn't have to have the compassion. He's obligated to kill. And if he's a grandson, he kills his grandfather. And Rashi explains, Mishum de'eno muzar al kvodo. He's not obligated to the kavod of his grandfather. So now we have a very exciting situation over here. We've got a marik that seems to contradict Rashi al Torah, and yet we have two Rashis on two sugyas in Shas that seem to support the marik, and that basically there is no chiyuv kivud to a grandfather, there's only chiyuv kivud to a father. And Rav Yaakov Emden, who lived about 4.5 centuries ago in Shelas Yavitz, he tries to paskin based on various proofs, like the Marik. And therefore, it would come out that a grandson does not have to say Kaddish for his grandfather. Not only that, that if his grandfather, alive and well, asks him for a cup of water, he could say to him, wait, I'm not your son. I'm your grandson. I'm not obligated to bring you a cup of water. I'll bring you a cup of water that's chesed, like I have to bring a cup of water for anybody, but not because you're my grandfather. So that's Rav Yaakov Emden accepting lahalach and the Marik. The Ramah himself, although he quoted the Marik, does not accept the Marik because he weighs in favor of Rashi al Torah that you are chayav in kvod avi aviv zkeno, albeit not on the same level as kvod aviv. Now, if you have these pages that David was kind enough to circulate on the email, you'll take a look on the next page, which is page number 2, which is called Taf Shin. And amongst those who argue against the Marik to support the Ramah's Psak and the Diuk that led us to the conclusion, the Deacon Rashi al Torah, that there is a chiyuv to give cover to your grandfather, we have the Sefer HaCharedim, and he invokes a very fundamental principle in halacha, which is a sugya Masechta Yevamos, called B'nei Banim Harei Hem Kibanim, which basically means, in, let's say, the context of Yevamos, that if, let's say, Reuven has, let's start with Yaakov. Let's say Yaakov has a son, Reuven. Reuven has a son, Chanoch. Reuven dies during the lifetime of his father, Yaakov. And now Yaakov has a grandson by the name of Chanoch. And the halacha is that if Yaakov dies without any children, because let's say he lost his child, his single child, and he has a brother, then that brother would theoretically be chayav in yibum to be miyabim the wife of Yaakov, because Yaakov left this world without any children. But no, the Gemara says b'nei bonim hareim kibonim, that Chanoch, so to speak, steps into the shoes of Reuven, and now Yaakov Avinu, so to speak, has a child, He has Zera, and there's no Yibum. Now, according to the Sefer HaCharedim, the very fact that B'nai Banim Hareim Kibanim means that there's a direct relationship between a grandson and a grandfather, hence there is a Chiyuv Kibud. And our diuk in Rashi al Torah in this week's Parshas VaYigash is a correct diuk, and the Ramah's psak against the Marik is correct. We're going to have to figure out what to do with those two sugyas that the Gaon Mivilna quotes to support the Marik, namely the Gemara in Sota regarding Rav Yaakov, who told his grandfather, Rav Acha, I'm not your son, and the Gemara in Makkas that says that a grandson will become a Gol Adam to kill his grandfather. But be that as it may, it turns out that although, notwithstanding the psak of Rav Yaakov Emden in Shelas Yavitz, who supported the Marik, the Ramah, and just about everyone who's worth a dime who came after the Ramah, all the poskim like our diuk in Rashi, against the Marik, that there is a chiyuv to be machabed one's grandfather. The Gaon himself, after bringing the proof from the Gemara in Sota, says that that proof is not very reliable. Why? Because there may be a fundamental difference between what we call a paternal grandfather and what we call a maternal grandfather. So let's say, for example, I have two sets of grandparents. I have my father's parents and I have my mother's parents. Says the Gaon, it's very possible that the diuk that we have in Rashi in this week's parsha regarding Yaakov Avinu, who gave kavod to Yitzchak rather than to his grandfather Avram, Rashi is referring to Avi Aviv, which means his paternal grandfather. But Enoch Hinabi, the Gemara in Sota, with regard to Rav Yaakov, if you read the Gemara carefully, Rav Yaakov was not the son of Rabbi Acha, but rather he was the son of the daughter of Rav Acha. So if you just quickly, turn the page back to where we started with, it says there that Rav Acha bikesh mi ben bito Rav Yaakov lashkos umayim. He was asking his grandson through his daughter. So if I have, for example, a set of grandparents through my mother, which means that this grandfather is only a grandfather to me through his daughter, so I become Ben Bito, then Ben Bito, it could be, doesn't have a chiyuv of kavod. But it's only in the case of Ben Beno that Rashi learned and derived the conclusion from Yaakov Avinu that there is a chiyuv of kavod to Avi Aviv, or from the grandfather, there's a relationship through his son to his grandson. But once again, what brings all these poskim to reject the Marik? Where is the basis, can we call it the Yisod, for this premise that Rashi seems to be operating with in the name of the Medrash, that you're chayav kavod to your zaki, to your grandfather? And we said that there's a halacha that's being invoked here by the Sefer HaCharedim, which is called Banim Arei, B'nai Banim Hareim Kibanim. However, that's not at all relevant to us, really. B'nai Banim Hareim Kibanim is halacha in what we call period of Arivia, in having children, what we call prodigy. Meaning, did you leave this world without any children? And the answer is, well, I have grandchildren, and that's sufficient to establish that I left a legacy, so to speak. And this could be an interesting nafkamina. Let's say Yaakov has a son, Reuven has a son, Chanoch. And now the question is, if let's say Yaakov's wife dies, for argument's sake, does Yaakov have to get remarried? According to halacha, Yaakov would have to get remarried if he did not fulfill the mitzvah period of Arivia. And if Yaakov left a grandson, then even if he didn't have a son, nevertheless he would be patur from getting married because he fulfilled the mitzvah period of Rivia based on the principle of b'nei banim arein kibanim, which would have no impact whatsoever on our discussion about kavod. We're not dealing with kavod here. We're dealing with a technical question in the laws and the mitzvah of period of Rivia. Can you fulfill the mitzvah period of Rivia through a grandchild? And the answer is b'nei banim arein kibanim, but that doesn't prove that a grandchild has a chiyuv kavod to a grandfather. So if that be the case, we really have to search a little bit harder, high and low, for a source for the conclusion of the Ramah and those who go with the derech of the Ramah and the Rashi and Chumash that there is a chiyuv kavod to a grandparent. Well, let's talk about a very sensitive issue for a moment. Why do I have to give kavod to my father? Obviously, the Torah says I have to. It's up there in the Aseres HaDibros. It's Exeris HaKosav at the very least. I can't question the Torah. But one could postulate that there is a chiyuv kavod to a parent because of Hakaras HaTov, out of a sense of gratitude. Now here we have to ask the following question. What do I owe to my father? Two possibilities. One way of saying it is I owe my father because the ovum of my mother and the sperm of my father met together, and hence I was born. In other words, my father is responsible for bringing me into this world. I find that a little bit superficial. I would rather say that my father taught me how to live, taught me how to think, how to feel as a Jew, taught me Torah. Vishinantom levanecha, he had a responsibility which he fulfilled to teach me Torah. It's a little bit sensitive because what's going to be in the case of a father who didn't teach his son Torah? Obviously, the mitzvah of kibbud av would still apply. But on a hashkafic level, on a philosophical, conceptual level, it could be that the mitzvah of kibbud av is rooted, is grounded in the obligation of the father and the fulfillment of that obligation to raise the child, not just to have the child, bring him into this world, but to give him Torah. And the transmission of Torah is like he created him. So the creation here is not the physical creation, but rather the spiritual creation of Veshinantam Levanecha, of transmitting the Torah to the son. If that be the case, then we might have a basis for a conclusion that one is obligated to give kavod not just to his father, but to his grandfather. And why is that? Because the Gemara establishes in Kiddushin, I write about this extensively in my Sefer, which is not published yet, that a grandson has to be taught Torah not only by his father, but also by his grandfather. And the Gemara in Kiddushin derives this from a pasuk. The pasuk says in Parshas VaYigash, "V'odatem levanecha ulivnei vanecha," and it's referring to the transmission of Torah. And the grandfather is obligated to transmit the Torah to his grandson. If that be the case, then to the same extent that we said that Yechayev and Kibbud Av, because the father is going to transmit the Torah to his son, so too, by virtue of the same logic, there's a chiyuv kibbud to a grandfather because the grandfather is obligated to pass on his Torah to his grandson. In fact, the Gemara in Kiddushin says that the mitzvah of odatem livnei vanecha is even greater than the mitzvah of shirantem levanecha, and that when a grandfather teaches Torah to his grandson, it's malol of hakosav kilu kivla me'ar Sinai. It's like the highest level of Torah, and it's a link in the Masorah, in the tradition, and the transmission of the Torah from one generation to two generations below it. That puts it on a special level. So therefore, you might postulate a chiyuv kibbud to a grandfather simply because of the obligation of the grandfather to teach Torah to his grandson. So it's not just that a father is a partner in the creation of his son, meaning the birth of the child, but rather that the father is in charge and responsible to fulfill his duty to transmit the Torah to his son, and therefore, by virtue of that logic, a grandfather is likewise obligated to transmit the Torah to his grandson. However, Abosai, with all these different explanations that seem to assume a direct relationship between the grandfather and the grandson, there's a simpler way of going without postulating and going that far as to say there's a grandfather-grandson relationship, but that kibbutz keno is built into kibbutz aviv. And let me explain. The Gemara wants to know what comes first. The kavod that you have to give to your father, or the kavod that you have to give to your mother. Both your parents. I had a principal in high school. He used to say, he was translating from the Yiddish. He used to say, bring me a signature from your father or your mother or one of your parents. Anyway, we used to make fun of him, but we were kids. Now, here's a case where your father and your mother are sort of in a tug of war, each one demanding a cup of water. Who do you give first? Where's the preference? So the Gemara uses a logic that goes as follows. You should give to your father first because ata ve'imecha chayavim b'kvod avicha. Now, this means that within the framework of marriage and the ksuba relationship between a husband and a wife is obligated in kavod to her husband. So that now you as a son, in terms of bringing water to your father, share a responsibility and obligation with your mother to bring a cup of water to your father. And therefore your father takes precedence because you and your mother alike have a chiyuv of kavod vis-a-vis your father. And if that be the case, then we can apply the same rigorous logic in the case where your father asks you for a cup of water and your grandfather asks you for a cup of water. And it comes down to the following, that your father is obligated to give kavod to your grandfather. So obviously you have to give kavod to your grandfather because insofar as the Torah obligates you to give kavod to your father, how much more so do you have to give kavod to your grandfather? Because your father himself is obligated to give kavod to his father, who's your grandfather. Yeah. Joe?
But it's not the same kavod. With regards to the father and the mother, would you say that would be a difference? We're cuddling with the idea of the kavod. Your idea of giving kavod with regards to the mother and you giving kavod to the father, that's the same kind of kavod. They both you and your mother have the same equal distance to giving kavod to the father. But with regard to you and your father and the grandfather, either it's through him or it's around him in a certain way. Would you not say that it's not necessarily the same, making the same logistical?
Well, Joe, I just want to make two comments. First of all, when it says that Tovi Mecha Chayav B'Kvod Avicha, it's not the same kavod. In other words, the kavod a wife has to give to a husband is only as long as they're married. In other words, it's within the marriage relationship. I mean, after the divorce, she doesn't have to give him any kavod, obviously. Your kavod to your father is eternal. It's not conditional, it's absolute. But leave that on the side. What we're trying to derive is that there is a chiyuv kavod to a grandfather insofar as it's incorporated in the chiyuv kavod that you have to give to your father. Meaning, if you have to give your kavod to your father and he in turn has to give kavod to your grandfather, then in effect you have to give kavod to your grandfather because you have to give kavod to your father. Meaning the kavod to your father is extended to the kavod that he has to give to his father, who's your grandfather. And now, the only problem with this is that it's not and all similar to all the other proofs that we gave to establish that you have to give cover to your grandfather, because those proofs like B'nai Banim Areim Kibanim, or for example, Vodatem Le B'nai Banecha, and so forth and so on. All those proofs are to create a direct relationship between your grandfather and the grandson. You have an obligation to your grandfather is in a direct link. Now we're saying something totally different, and there's a tremendous nafkamina. Now we're saying that your chiyuv kavod to your father, to your grandfather, is through your father. Now it's that chiyuv kavod is to your father now becomes a link to the chiyuv kavod that your father has to your grandfather. Hence, through that link, you in turn have a chiyuv kavod to your grandfather. But let's say your father dies, then you don't have a chiyuv to your grandfather. No, it's the whole. The theory here of cover to your grandfather stands on the chiyuv cover you have to your father. If your father's gone, then what links you up to your grandfather? So that's a tremendous nafkamina. And if you take a look in this page that I asked you to open up, Taf Shin, you'll see here that number one, be ofen shemes ha'av, if the father dies, then according to this last piece of logic, which by the way is the Stei Chemed, he was a Rav in Yerushalayim, a Sephardi Rav, you don't have a chiyuv to your grandfather according to that logic, because your chiyuv to your grandfather is only through your father, and your father died. But then he says something else in Nova Beis, v'avi imo, let's say his maternal grandfather, the father of his mother, and the Gaon had said that we don't apply the principle of B'nai Banim Areim Kibanim, because that's limited to Avi Aviv, and the Gemara in Sota is talking about a case of Avi Imo. According to the Charedim, who's invoking the principle of B'nai Banim Kibanim, that would not apply to B'nai Banos, because period of review always goes through the male. And for that matter, if we base ourselves on the relationship between Avram and Yaakov, the grandfather and the grandson, well, there it's again Ben Achar Ben, so it's Avi Aviv. But if we go to Stei Chemed, then forget about Aviv. You're Chayiv and Kvod Zkeno because you're Chayiv and Kvod Imo. So even if your grandfather is your maternal grandfather, so my mother's maiden name was Goldentire. So my grandfather's name on my mother's side was Elchanan Goldentire. I have the name Elchanan too, Azari Elchanan. So my grandfather is someone to whom my mother would be obligated in kavod, and therefore, since I'm obligated in kavod to my mother, and she's obligated in kavod to Elchanan Goldentire, therefore I have to give kavod to Elchanan Goldentire, and it's irrelevant that he's my grandfather on the maternal side. That should make no difference. So now we move on to page Taf Shin Aleph, and we still have, I think, about 7 minutes left, depending upon when the Pinsker Shul opens, of course.
I told you you can continue even after I have
No.
to leave.
Without you, Bruce.
I can stay. Let's keep going. So we'll see what we can do.
Okay, we'll see if you can last till 4. In my minion, they don't start mincha till 4:30. So I don't know if it takes you more than a half hour to get there to set it up.
No, I can stay till 4 easily today.
Okay, great. So I don't know why your yad is always on the same place in the Sefer Torah. I mean, your Balkore is very slow. Like, doesn't he make any progress? Like,
well, yesterday we rolled some of the Torahs for.
I see. Yeah. So on page Tafshin Aleph, which is the third page in your little package here, there are more paskins that you have a chiyuv to be machabed your grandfather, but your chiyuv to your father is greater than that of your chiyuv to your grandfather. And there's a great Talmud Chacham named Fleshkis. He wrote Tshuva Me'ava. I actually have it here in this room, the original Tshuva Me'ava from like 2.5 centuries ago. And the Gemara says the following: Sha'al, Gemara in Kedushin, Sha'al ben Almana Es Rabbi Eliezer Abba Omer Shkeni Mayim Ve'im Omer Shkeni Mayim Zem Kodem Amalei Hanach Kvod Imech Vasei Kvod Avicha Shatov Imech Chayom Kvod Avicha. This is the Gemara that we quoted before. Hachinami Neima Kevin Di Ata Chay Bekvod Zkenecha Ve'Avicha Chay Bekvod Avicha Hanach Kvod Avicha Vasei Kvod Zkenecha Shatov Avicha Chayom Bekvod. Tremendous kasha here. How could it possibly be that there are more paskins that, and that's Rashi and Chumash in this week's parsha, that the covenant you give to your father takes precedence over the covenant you're giving to your grandfather? The same way the Gemara established that the covenant you're giving to your father takes precedence over the covenant you give to your mother, so you don't bring your mother the tea, you bring your father the tea, because you and your mother are chayiv in kvod avicha. The same logic should make kvod zkenecha adif. It should be kodem to kvod avicha, because again, you and your father are chayiv in the kavod of your grandfather. And based on this question, the tshuva me'ava comes to the conclusion, halacha l'maisa, that if your grandfather asks you for a cup of water, and your father asks you for a cup of water, you should give your grandfather first, because you and your father are chayiv in the covenant of your grandfather. However, he says, if let's say it wasn't a case where they were both present at the same time, shelo b'fnei zeh, b'zeh shelo b'fnei zeh, chayiv yosef b'kvod avicha. So again, if your father is there, and your grandfather asks for a cup of water, then he, your father, is chayiv in kvod of your grandfather. Therefore, the grandfather takes precedence. But if your father is here and your grandfather is here, and they both have some sort of issue of you're fulfilling the covenant, then you would give your father first and fulfill his covenant first, because that's a greater chiyuv covenant than that of your grandfather, because your chiyuv to your grandfather is only insofar as the fact that your father's chayiv in the covenant of your grandfather. But again, the psak here of the Ramah and others, based on the Gemara Kiddushin, is that you give your grandfather first. I'm sorry, that you logically you should be giving your grandfather first. That would be the seemingly logical conclusion from the Gemara Kiddushin. But yet, the Ramah codifies the halacha that your chiyuv cover to your father is greater. So how do we reconcile that with the Gemara Kiddushin Vatov Avicha Chayav Mekvod Zkenecha, or in the Gemara's language Vatov Imecha Chayav Mekvod Avicha? Now, here in the Minchas Asher, he spends many pages trying to answer this kasha. And if you only read superficially, you never know where he comes up with the answer, because he goes through so many different issues, his Galgal Adover, and, he doesn't emphasize the final conclusion, the answer that he gives. But let me try to present what I think the Minchas Asher has in mind. And if I'm wrong, then he'll forgive me. If I'm right, then Baruch Shekivad. The issue of Atavi Mecha Chayav Mechvod Avicha is a technicality. Let me explain what I mean by a technicality. We need to know before, in actuality, what to do in this case. Should I bring water to my mother? Should I bring water to my father? They're both asking for water. So there are technical rules that apply in this case, because without a technical rule, we're really stuck. Why are we stuck? Because the Torah says, Kabedes avicha v'simecha, and in Yira, for example, the Torah even gives the mother precedence, and the Gemara says that basically the kibud that you owe to your father and the kibud to your mother are equal. There's no difference between the two. There's really just a toss-up here in terms of the basic definition of kibud between your father and your mother. I don't know who to bring first. Maybe I should just put the cup in front of them and let them fight it out if I only have one cup. I think we used to call it in elementary school, we used to play steal the bag. You remember that game? You have two people, they can't touch it, can't get the bag, so So here the Gemara comes up with a technicality. We'll never know the answer to the question which kavod is greater, that of your mother or that of your father, because there is no answer to that question. They're equal. One is not superior to the other. But since technically I need to know what to do in a case where I have two chiyuvei kavod that are equal one to the other, so we apply the technical rule of kedima, and we give kedima to the father and bring him the water because the mother is chayiv in his kavod. As if to say, well, you're fulfilling your mother's will and her obligation by seeing to it that your father has the cup of water. But whatever it is, I'm not getting into that whole discussion. I'm just saying that these are klale kedima. You have to have a klal of kedima to know to whom do I give the water. However, when it comes to a father and a grandfather, we're not going to apply these klale kedima because this is a different kind of kedima. This is a kedima of your father because inherently the chiyuv kibbut to your father is greater, that much greater than the chiyuv kibbut to your grandfather. Your primary relationship and kibbut is to your father. Although there's an extension to that called your grandfather, for whatever reason, whether it's b'nei banim, whether it's because the Torah considers him your father to some extent, and vodata livnei vanecha, and he has to teach you Torah, or maybe because your father is chayiv and covered to your grandfather, therefore you're chayiv insofar. All these svaras, you can say whatever svara you want. But at the end of the day, if you ask me to weigh on a scale the two chiyuvei kavod, that of your father and that of your grandfather, there's no question the chiyuv of your father will outweigh that of your chiyuv kibbut to your grandfather by light years. And in such a case, we're not going to apply some sort of technical hilchos klale kedima. We know what should come first. Your father comes first because that's the ikar main primary chiyuv kibbut. So we're not going to say, well, Hanach l'kvod avicha because atov avicha chayav b'kvod zkenecha. That svara will not appear anywhere except in the Tshuva Mi'ava, because that svara is based on the fact that there's an equal kibbut. So the kind of svara that the Gemara uses and employs, and is a case where the chiyuv kibbut is equal in both sides of the equation, and therefore I don't know how I'm supposed to move here from the spot. Who do I bring the water to? So then we apply this technicality in Hilchas Kedima, that you give your father first because your mother, etc., etc. But that has nothing to do with father and grandfather, because there inherently there are two fundamentally different chiyuvei kibbut, and the ikar kibbut is kvod avicha. Now let me conclude with the following Taz. This is a Taz elsewhere, and this is where we wrap it up. The Taz wants to know what comes first, saving someone's life or studying Torah. And he quotes a Gemara Megillah about Mordechai. Mordechai at the end of the Megillah is called Rotzi L'Rov Echav. He was no longer, the Gemara says, on the same level that he was before the Megillah. It's only L'Rov V'lo L'Kol. And the reason for that is because he took over as the second in command to the prime minister, the prime minister, filling in for whatever his name was there. I don't want to mention his name. It gets me angry because we're so full of them today in every country in the world. So that the Taz says the following: although it's true, if you're learning Torah, you have to drop the Torah for the sake of saving someone's life. But if you ask me, says the Taz, which mitzvah is greater, the mitzvah of Torah study is greater than the mitzvah of saving lives. Could you believe it? That's the Taz. The only thing is that in Kedima, there are technicalities in Kedima. We can't let someone die because of your great mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And even though the mitzvah of Talmud Torah inherently is that much greater than the mitzvah of Hatzalas Nefashos, and Mordechai HaYehudi goes down in his level because now he has no choice but to dedicate his kochos, his time and his effort to saving Jewish lives and protect them against all the Amalekim of then, and there were plenty of them then, and we need someone to dedicate themselves, besides the idea of here in Israel, to protect us against all the Amalekim throughout the world, whether it's Monday, whether it's Australia, whether it's here, whether it's Canada, whether it's Crete, and again Cyprus, wherever you want to tell you name it. We need someone to do that. But that someone, if he's learning Torah and he has to give up his Torah learning for the sake of Atzolos Nefashos, according to Taz at least, is going to go down in his madrega. He's forfeiting a greater mitzvah for a lesser mitzvah. It doesn't matter. In Dinei Kedima, there are technical laws of Kedima. So in terms of mother and father both asking for water, there's a technical rule of Kedima. I have to give to my father first and my mother second. Not because the cover to my father is greater than that of the cover to my mother. Okay, then we'll stop here and wish you a great week. I hope you got something out of this year. Call to